I take a look at the story, absorb it, try to think, what can I say? What does this remind me of? What's this an example of? What have we here? And what comes out, I hope that I haven't lost the thing that interested me in the story in the first place.
Longtime broadcaster Charles Osgood, today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. Well, most journalists do a pretty good job of crafting a straight news story in that classic inverted pyramid style with all the facts objectively and expertly told. But then there are other journalists who can take that same set of facts and add context and perspective and tell it with such grace and style that it almost becomes a different story. And one of the great practitioners in that second category was longtime CBS radio and television newsman and personality Charles Osgood. His special talent was taking the mundane and turning it into something sparkling. He could take the most dry government pronouncement and turn it into a story you'll be telling your grandchildren. Well, Charles Osgood, he had a daily feature on CBS radio called The Osgood File. So in 1991, when he published a collection of some of his best works, he of course called it The Osgood Files. And that's when I first met him. In just a moment, my conversation with the great Charles Osgood.
We're about to take a step back and listen to an iconic voice from our recent past. It's one of over 10,000 interviews noted radio personality Bill Thompson did over a 30-year span. We think you'll enjoy it.
So here now from 1991, Charles Osgood.
Some of the things that are in this book are written, I say they're original, and in this book, written just for this book. Actually, they were written for a book that was to have been all original material, but I never wrote that book. But the material is still okay, and so it's in this book.
Actually, if you stop and think about it, many of the things that you wrote in here were under a deadline of hours, if not minutes, as opposed to a normal book that has a deadline of months or years.
Actually, it's a little better than that, because what's in this book, apart from the strictly original material that's in there, written for nothing except this book, I would say that accounts for about 6 pages in this book. But most of the rest of the stuff is stuff that was written for print. I do 2 columns a week for the Tribune Media Syndicate, and I did a humor column for Time for the USA Weekend. And a lot of the material is from those print offerings, and some of that material, though, was recycled from a previous radio or television broadcast. And so, I mean, one of the things, if you're in this business and you were given an opportunity to work in various fields, I mean, why waste a perfectly good thought that you had on radio and not include it in your column? And if you're collecting some of the best of your material to use in a book, then why not indeed use it again? So in some cases, these things ought to be, these little gems in here should be well polished by now because they've been around.
But that also points out the difficulty of assembling a book of columns or a book of radio broadcasts or whatever it may be, a collection of. There are many it was a great joke when you told it, but the test of time has made it obsolete.
Yes, but you have the opportunity to do that, to look at it and say, boy, that was funny then. And there are some things that seem, the currency is, I would say that it has a half-life of about 4 days. And some things are very funny. Last week or the week before, there was a rash of mother of all this and that.
I was just thinking of that.
So George Bush is able to say, I want you to meet the mother of all Bushes, Barbara Bush. But so that's still a little bit funny because it's a new context for it. But, believe me, in a month, mother of all jokes won't be funny at all.
And a year from now or 2 years from now,
people won't even know what you mean.
They'll scratch their heads and say, what is he talking about?
Of course, the reference is to Saddam Hussein's mother of all battles, but we're going to forget about that. And then, anything that's based on that becomes not funny.
Is it easier to be clever, witty, funny on a daily basis when you can hit that timely topic than it is to do what Robert Benchley did and write for the ages? Absolutely.
In fact, even when I did the humor column for USA Weekend, they wanted the material about a month ahead. And I found it so hard to be funny. Be funny a month from now. It's hard enough to be funny this afternoon, but you can base it on something. There are a lot of things that you have in common with the audience. If you're doing a broadcast in a given city, if you're in Washington, you look out the window and say, today is a lovely day. You know that both you and the audience know that it's a lovely day. Therefore, you can say, well, listen, this is some terrible day, isn't it? Ha, ha, ha. And they know that you're kidding because it isn't a terrible day. But obviously, that's not going to hold up. I mean, it might not even hold up for the next hour. And so topical humor is, for that reason, easier. And in fact, if you are able to make some sort of side reference to shared information, because it's just, that it's all now going on, that's the secret of Bob Hope's topical humor. You make some little. It doesn't even have to be particularly funny, but you say, yes, I know what he's talking about. I'm on the inside too. And it isn't stuff that you're going to look at and think is very funny a year from now.
The illusions just don't always hold up very well. Yet I think we'd be also very limiting your material unnecessarily if we said it's all funny. I mean, there's some things in here that are clearly not funny, but yet they're very poignant in their own ways.
Well, I start when I'm looking at wire service stories to decide whether or not I'm going to use this particular one for an Osgood file on CBS Radio, and my test is, do I find myself titillated, amused, or offended and outraged or whatever? There should be some reaction in me which is not purely intellectual. I'm not going to look at this and say, what, 275 billion? That's too high a number. 212 billion would be okay. These are sort of these quantitative judgments that you can make about what number is too high or too low. Don't translate into my kind of work. But being mad does, and being amused does, and laughing and crying and all those other things. So I try to look for something that has some impact on me, and then in rewriting it, and I never just rewrite it sentence for sentence. I take a look at the story, absorb it, try to think, what can I say? What does this remind me of? What's this an example of? What have we here? Put it into that kind of mix. And what comes out, I hope that I haven't lost the thing that interested me in the story in the first place.
You also, though, walk a thin line because you don't want to put you in the story. If the story's not about you, the story is the story. And I remember Charlie Kuralt, when he was talking about his book, he said that when he does his pieces for TV, he makes an effort not to get into the picture because the story should tell the story.
Well, he is really a model for anybody that's interested in this kind of feature reporting. Today, especially on local television, you'll see reporters showing how they, rode the log flume or whatever it was down. This is reporter involvement. But I think Kuralt is in the pieces very much. They're all very, he Kuraltizes those pieces. You can be sure that they all have his stamp. At the same time, he's not wearing the funny hat. He's not hanging by his heels. He's not doing whatever the thing is that the story is about. It's a different kind of involvement. You're seeing it through his eyes, and that's what's important. He's transmitting to you his conception, his perception of what it is that the story is about. And in the case of somebody who's a genius like Kuralt, that means that you're getting a very fresh and very stylized perspective indeed. When I say stylized, I don't mean that as a put down because, when you look at a Van Gogh, it's a Van Gogh too.
But I'm sure hear when you're going home, you hear on the radio other people reading the same wire copy that you used when you created the Osgood file. And they're reading a straight wire copy, and it's still the same story, but I'm sure you've heard this, they make such an effort to make it that funny story, and when they get that punchline, boy, they really deliver it, but it just falls flat because it takes somebody to take that story and, as you say, reshape it, take it, and tell us a story so that when you get to the punchline, it really has a punch to it.
Well, my reorganization of a story, and I very often will reorganize it, does several things to a conventional wire service story. Most of the wire service stories are written according to the standard journalistic formula, which is, the inverted triangle. You put as much information as all of the necessary information goes into the first couple of sentences, and then the story becomes the detail that you're providing as you go along becomes less and less important. So that, because this is based on newspaper experience, so that the copy editor can always cut it from the bottom. and you will not lose the essence of the story, which is contained in the top. But that's not the way you tell a story. If something interesting happens to you on the way home, you don't say to your wife, 4 killed in car crash, and then back into the story, giving her less and less important information as you go along. You say, I was going home, I was tired, I was walking down the street, I heard this noise, I turned around, 2 cars were coming, I thought, oh my God, and the light was changing, and before my eyes, and so you tell the story in sequence, and you put the payoff, just as you would the punchline of a joke or the end of a short story, the punchline's at the end. So the structure of a radio piece is very different from the structure of a wire service story or of a newspaper piece. You have to bear that in mind when you're writing for print. By the way, a newspaper has a front page, and it has the top of the front page and the bottom, and then some stories are continued on page 38. If you're writing a book, you don't have that same problem. I mean, yes, you can turn a page to get the information, but it's not continued several pages later, and it can't be cut from the bottom. So you have the advantage of if excising is necessary, that you do it from the inside. You don't necessarily cut the head off something or the feet off it.
Not only that, but if somebody doesn't like that particular column, they simply turn the page, go to the next one. Whereas on the radio, when they punch that button, they're now on a whole different station.
Yes, you're gone. I mean, if you have either bored or offended your audience, they are now listening to somebody else.
After this short break, Charles Osgood shows us an example of his unique take on the news.
Are you enjoying this conversation so far?
And would you like to get a copy of the book we're talking about?
Just tap the link in our show notes or visit our website, heardeverything.com.
When you make a purchase through our affiliate links, you're also supporting this podcast.
And we thank you for your support.
Now back to my 1991 conversation with Charles Osgood.
Where does being a thoughtful, reflective, sometimes funny, sometimes poignant columnist or commentator or newscaster end and pomposity begin?
Well, that's something that you have to watch out for, and I hope that if I start to get pompous, that somebody will come and tell me about it right away, because I suppose you can become pompous. I suppose that pompous people don't know they're pompous. If they knew that that's what they were being, they wouldn't be that. But I don't know. I think that there's a danger in this business because you're talking about subjects of some importance. And, 1 minute you're talking about some scientific story, and another you're talking about economics, and another you're talking about politics, and now you're talking about international affairs or whatever it is. But we don't know anything about those things. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't know a dime's worth more about any of those things than people in my audience. The only advantage that I have over them is that since I arrived at the office, I have the benefit of some new information that just came in, and that's why we're doing that particular story, is because of some development that I happen to be standing here, and the wires are moving these stories. So that's it. But that's it. That's the only edge you have, because they have the opportunities to read the same newspapers you do, to read the same news magazines, and to read the same books if they choose. So you're not, if you pose as an authority, unless you happen to be one, that's a dangerous kind of stance. So people will say, you'll make a speech someplace, and there'll be a question and answer period. And they'll say, what do you think we ought to do, Mr. Osgood, about the education crisis in this country? And you have to really stop and say, wait a minute. You are not talking to an educator. I'm a parent. I can tell you, as the parent of 5 kids, what worries me about education and the state of it today, and what I think is, important and not important. But understand that this is not coming from any expertise at all. So as soon as you pose as an expert, you're starting to be in trouble. That's number one. The other thing is, I think you can put some of yourself into it as long as people know you. Mm-hmm. If you're talking to a fresh audience and you come along and all of a sudden you start doing something that's quite bizarre, then people may feel, there's this nut who's broadcasting now on CBS. But if they know you because for years you've been on the air and you're on 4 times a day and they've heard you do things like this before, for example, when the latest tax reform business was being proposed, Robert Krulwich, who does wonderfully witty pieces, mostly about economics, for CBS This Morning, mentioned just in passing, he said, you know, who's really going to be hurt by this is Charlie Osgood. He said, because what's happening is you're not, over a certain income level, if you make more than $100,000 a year, and you've been taking dependents, if you have a number of kids, and I've got 5 of them, that means that each one you used to be able to take, you're not going to be able to take those dependents anymore if you're over a certain income. So he's going to get killed by something like this. So I thought, well, isn't that lovely to hear that, I'm singled out as an example of somebody that's really getting it, getting it in this situation. So I did a piece, sort of a fantasy piece, in which I call the kids in and explain that I'm going to have to let 2 of them go. And I use all the cliches about downsizing, and nothing personal about this. You understand? We've been very happy with your performance as a child, but it's just not efficient. The government, obviously, the Congress feels that we've overextended ourselves here. We just need to get a little more efficient, and so I'm going to have to let a couple of you go, and we'll do everything we can to make the transition easy for you and all of that. But people say, well, what did the kids think about that? Because I mentioned them by name. I said, I think Annie and Jamie, I'm going to have to let the 2 of you go. You have the least seniority, and you're not able to do as much as some of the others can do. So, yeah. But obviously, you're being silly. But you're also pointing out that this is obviously going to be a problem for people, and it's also making fun of the mentality, the new business mentality of downsizing, and people are getting hurt while that's going on. But you can actually poke a little gentle fun at that while you're making a fairly serious point.
You also discover quickly how many people just don't get it.
Well, I don't think I ran into anybody that didn't get it. They don't. I have never heard boo from anybody who thought that I was actually going to get rid of some of my kids.
I did want to ask one more thing, and I have to ask an impolitic question before that. Are you old enough to remember Pearl Harbor?
Oh, yes.
Okay. What I'm doing over the next few months in anticipation of Pearl Harbor Day, the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor Day, is collecting from people who, as they pass through the studio, their recollections, so that on December 7th, I'll have this whole stack of tapes of prominent people as they pass through here. Could I get you just to tell me?
Remember how it was?
Yeah, where you were, what you were doing, what you remember of that day.
Of course, that is the classic date that people say everybody remembers. And indeed, I guess everybody but George Bush remembered the date. On December the 7th, 1941, it was a Sunday, and I was 8 years old, and my sister and I had attended, to show you how times have changed, a minstrel show at Our Lady of Lourdes Church in Baltimore, Maryland. We lived about half a block from the church. And the people in the minstrel show were all people who we knew. They were neighbors and fellow members of the congregation at Our Lady of Lourdes. The barber who cut our hair did a funny barber routine as part of this thing. It was, I remember laughing very hard at the show. It seemed to me to be a great show. But you had people in blackface, and you had things that today would be absolutely people would be in horror about these things. This was sort of taken for granted then. But a fellow whose name is Bill Neville, who is a man who was a friend of our family's and a sort of elder of the church, stood up and made an announcement. He said, this is something that you should know, because it's very important, and for you children, be sure to mention it to your parents when you go home. But he said, the Japanese have just bombed and otherwise attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, this meant absolutely nothing to me, but I could see there was this gasp went up in the auditorium. And when we went home and said the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, I think what we said, because it was the way it was announced, was that the Japs had attacked Pearl Harbor. Of course, my folks turned on the radio, and there it was. And even now, listening to the interruption, the voice of John Daly comes across the radio, saying that that Pearl Harbor had been attacked by aircraft. And some of the wire services wanted to be absolutely sure that they didn't overstate the case, and so they said planes bearing the emblem of the rising sun attacked Pearl Harbor today. Maybe it was somebody else those planes with that emblem on them. But anyway, I can remember just how shocked we all were. And of course, radio at that time was the medium that tied everybody together. And then it was the next day that Franklin Roosevelt made his speech to Congress. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, date that will live in infamy. Well, it certainly lives in the recollection of anybody who was alive then, even if they were only 8.
Charles Osgood died in 2024. He was 91. Now, you can get your copy of The Osgood Files by Charles Osgood by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also hear my 1994 conversation with Charles Osgood's longtime CBS colleague, Dan Rather.
A good reporter must be skeptical. Cynicism is something completely different. I can truthfully say that while I've made a lot of mistakes, becoming a cynic is not one of them.
And my 1998 conversation with someone else who could take some ordinary facts and turn it into something extraordinary and entertaining, P.J. O'Rourke.
Economics tells you how things happen, and it tells you why things happen. But all we really care about in our personal lives is what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, and economics is as useless as a Ouija board on those subjects.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, one of the most talented satirists of our time tells the story of how Jesus came back, but no one recognized him. No one. My 2006 conversation with the great Tony Hendra.
It seems to me inconceivable that Christ, who obviously was a great preacher, did not crack the odd joke from time to time. I mean, all great public speakers know how to do that, I mean, I've often thought that somewhere buried in the gospel there might be some one-liners.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.